All right, guys, so in this tutorial, we're going to be focusing on JavaScript functions. If you're here, I'm assuming you're coming more from a beginner's background, so I'm going to be keeping this simple and as concise and short as I can. We're basically going to be looking at a few examples of functions in JavaScript and just understanding the anatomy and how they can be used. So I'm going to be using Atom for this tutorial, and I'm working off of a Mac. For those of you who don't have Atom or you need a code editor to work from, you can download Atom from the atom.io website, and it will show you the download option for your operating system. It is free, so feel free to download that, and you can go ahead and get started. So to get the project going, the way I'm going to do things is we're going to be running the project in our browser console. It's going to be just a very simple activity, and I'm going to be doing it with basic HTML boilerplate and then a JavaScript file attached. This is just to get you into the habit of setting up a basic HTML project connected to a JavaScript file. So I've got a folder set up here in my work area. So I'm just going to go in and create a new file. That file is going to just be a basic index.html file. And I'll just set up some basic HTML boilerplate. So if you are using a code editor that allows you to make use of shortcuts, this is just a shortcut where I type out HTML and press tab, and it gives me the starter boilerplate. I'll just give my browser tab a title of JS functions, and just leave it at that. And then just before the closing body tag, I'm going to place a script tag. And in my script tag, I'm going to name the source as my JavaScript file. I'm just going to call this one functions.javascript. And I'm going to save it. And then I'll just add a JavaScript file called functions. So I'll just add a new file inside of my folder. And now we're ready to get going. So in order to get this project rendering in our browser, I'm just going to go into the index.html file and copy the full path of that file. And I'll go into my browser, paste that path, and it will display in my browser. So we can see here that I've got a JS functions project that's rendering here. I'm just going to take that / out. And we're going to work specifically from our browser console. So I'm just going to inspect element here, and my browser console will come up. And that's where we're going to see all of our JavaScript code. So this is just to get you guys into the habit of setting up a basic project and making use of the dev tools and browser console. It's very useful when you're setting up projects and just working with web development tools on the front end. So the first example we're going to go through is just the basic declaration of a function. So the way in which we do that is we use the function keyword, and we can give our function a name. So I'm just going to call this example function. And after the name of the function, we always want to make sure we place round brackets. This is where we place our optional arguments. We don't necessarily have to pass arguments to our functions, but it all depends on what you want your function to do. If your function requires additional parameters or values, you may want to pass parameters in these round brackets in order to use those values when you are calling the function. After the round brackets, you are going to give yourself a pair of curly braces, and these curly braces represent the block or the body of your function. So the stuff that your function actually does will go inside of this body on line 3, where you see my cursor. I'm just going to make this function log something to my console. So just something very basic. This is my function. I'm just going to leave it at that. And that's an example function with 0 arguments, and what it will do is log to the console this message that I've passed into it. So if we then want to see our function perform or do the thing that we've asked it to do, we have to call it. So the way in which we do that is we have to get the name of the function that we declared, and on line 6 I'm going to paste that, and when we give it these pair of round brackets, that means we've called the function. So now that I've called this function, I'm going to refresh my browser to see that function call in my console. And the reason why I'm able to see this message here is because that's what we asked our function to do. We asked it to console log or log to the console this message. If we, let's say, replace this with something else, like we can maybe do something like 2 times 2. Just ask it to perform that simple arithmetic, then we can refresh and we'll get a number instead. So we'll get the number 4, which represents the answer to this arithmetic that we passed into the console log. So that's the first example, and I'll just comment this out, make that example number 1. Now, if we move on to example number 2, this is going to be just a quick example to show you guys what a function looks like when we give it arguments and how we would make use of those arguments. So I'm going to create a function called second example. And inside of this second example function, I'm going to pass in an argument. I'm going to say that I want a required parameter to be a message. And we'll do the same thing we did in the previous example. We'll just give it a pair of curly braces to represent the body. And what we'll do this time is, instead of logging to the console a message that we give to that console log function, we're just going to log to the console the actual message argument. So what will happen is, when we call this function, we're going to supply it with an argument that will represent our message, and that will be logged to the console instead. So let's see how that goes. So I'm just going to copy the name of this function here. And what I'll do is I will give it a message of hello there. So now that I've supplied it with the argument that it's requested, let's see what it does. So now we see that in our console, it has logged a message for us because that's what we gave it to do. So in the next example, we're going to be looking at an anonymous function in JavaScript. And for those of you who are familiar with JavaScript, or you've done your own investigation into JavaScript, you may have heard of anonymous functions, which basically, as their name denotes, they're functions that don't immediately have a name specified after the function keyword, but they are typically used in function expressions. So I'll just show you guys an example. So let's go with example number 3. And in this example, what we'll do is we'll create an anonymous function. And in this anonymous function, we will log to the console my name is Valerie. So this is what an anonymous function would look like, but in JavaScript, we can't actually use this function the way it is. We need to use it in some sort of expression. And for those of you who don't know, expressions are basically blocks of code or snippets of code that evaluate to some kind of value. So typically something that has an equal sign, as an example. So the part that comes after the equal sign would be what we call an expression, just as an example. So let's say we set this function equal to a variable of some kind. So we assigned this function, or the value that this function returns, to some kind of variable. And what I'll do is I'll just give this the name no name. So this, on line 17, this function is called no name, and it is a function expression because the variable no name will evaluate to the return value of this function. So if we want to call this anonymous function, we would call it with the variable name that we gave it. So as an example, we'll make a call to this function, no name. And when we call functions, we have to make sure we use these pair of round brackets. Without the round brackets, the function is not called. We typically may see this in the form of a reference. So if we make a reference to this function in some block of code or in some line of code, that is what it would look like as a reference. But in this case, we're making a call, so we have to include those the pair of round brackets. So when we make that call and we refresh our browser, we will see this logged to the console. My name is Valerie, and that's basically what we had written in the body of this anonymous function. So there are also named function expressions. So if I was to set up another example here, we can have a function expression that we call first function, and we'll name a function after the equals sign. So in this case, I'll call this subtract. Oops. And this function will accept 2 arguments. And then in the body, we will basically just console log what the subtracted values or what the difference is. So num1 minus num2 is going to be the return value in our console. So we call this function. We will use the name of the variable rather than the name of the function itself. So I will take this variable name and I will use that to call the function. And inside of the brackets, I will pass in my parameters. We will pass in a 5 and a 3. And then we'll see what that evaluates to. We get 2 in our console. So in this next example, we're going to have a look at the function constructors. That's another way in which you can set up a function. So I'll call this example, example number 5. And the way we can make use of a function constructor, and for those who don't know, there are different types of constructors available in JavaScript, such as the array constructor, object constructors, and we also have access to function constructors. So if we want to set up an expression where we have a variable called, let's say, my function, and we then, oops, no, that's not what we're doing. We then can use the new keyword to instantiate like a new instance of the function constructor. And inside the round brackets, we would provide the parameters that we wanted for that function. So we'll say x, and we'll say y, and then we will say we want this to return x plus y as an example. So this is the return that we would want this function to provide once it's performed the arithmetic that we've given to it. So if I made a call to this function, I'll basically just do another console log, and I will make a call to the my function, and I will provide it with 2 parameters, so a 5 and a 4. When we refresh our browser, then we'll see that that evaluates to 9 because of what we gave to this function constructor. I don't typically, I haven't really seen this in action. I was doing some reading in an article, and I noticed that this was another option that JavaScript offers, but I don't see it used all that often, so I'm not sure if it's all that popular, but it is something I wanted to mention in this section of the tutorial. And then we also have access to arrow function syntax, so I'll make that the next example. With arrow functions, they're the more compact version of setting functions up in your JavaScript, and there's something that ES6 provides to us, makes it easier to read the syntax because it's not as wordy. It isn't really something that beginners would start with, but it is something that you're more than welcome to use because it's the more popular way of setting up functions. So I'm going to set up just a basic arrow function in the form of a constant. So I'll set up, let me see, a function called add. And basically the way arrow function syntax works is we can set up arrow functions with no parameters. So if I do that, I would then just provide some empty round brackets there, and then an arrow representing the function itself. So this round This pair of round brackets and the arrow are what form the arrow function syntax. And they're typically done in the form of an expression, the way you see it here. And then after the arrow, we get our round, not our round, but our curly braces. And within those curly braces, we would set up the body of our function. So in this case, we'll log something else to the console. So let's see, we can just log a simple message. How about the sky is blue? And when we then make a call to that function, we'd make the call the same way we would any other type of function that I've specified above, and it will basically print to the console the message that we provided it. So that's one example of an arrow function with no parameters. I'll just quickly show you guys an example of an arrow function with parameters. So I'll just use the same name and maybe call this sky instead. I didn't intend to call that add because we're not actually adding anything. But on line 41, I will create an arrow function called add, and this arrow function will accept two parameters, argument 1 and argument 2, and we will follow it with an arrow and then a function body. Inside of this function body, we will log to the console the sum of those two parameters. So what I'll do is arg1 plus arg2, and that is what it will return. And then I will call my function with two numbers, just two random numbers. When we make that function call, arg is not defined. Oh, that is my mistake. So I will just correct that and refresh, and we get our sum here on line 42, the number 7. So I believe those are the examples I can think of. And just to quickly summarize, we've gone through about, I guess, 6 or 7 examples here. We've got a basic function declaration using the function keyword with no parameters. And we basically just logged some math to the console. Then in our second example, we decided we wanted some parameters or a parameter. So instead we gave it a parameter and passed that argument to our function call. And then we looked at a function expression, so an anonymous function that has been assigned to a variable. And then we also looked at the function expression but with a named function. And we looked at our function constructor on line 31, which is another way in which we can declare a function. And then we also have arrow syntax, so arrow function syntax, which is something that ES6 provides us in JavaScript. So these are a couple of examples down here. So just noticing the patterns, function calls are pretty much the same across the board, regardless of what format you use to declare your function. Just remember that when you call your function, you need those round brackets to actually make the function call. Otherwise, you will get some buggy code. If you do plan to use parameters in your functions, just make sure you understand what those parameters are going to mean, because you set the parameters within your function. So if you do provide parameters to your function, you just have to know that you're going to need to use them and what they're being used for. So I hope that was helpful for you guys. This is just a basic tutorial on functions in JavaScript. And it is important to understand the different ways in which you can declare and call functions so that you can make full use of your JavaScript programs.